Good morning. So it's intimate, and maybe that's good. Definitely want to take this opportunity to thank AFCIA for the privilege to speak and discuss SBOMs with you. This came together fairly recently, and as mentioned, I just feel honored to have the opportunity to talk about the topic of software bill of materials with you all. So I'm Mark Altschuler. I'm a senior customer success manager with Aqua Security. I'm based in North America. Been there for a few years now, working with a large customer base, which includes the federal government, many agencies, largely DoD, and it's taken me to some pretty interesting places around the America. So that's my background in brief. I have a cohort here in Alan Friedman. He probably knows more or has forgotten more than I'll ever learn about this topic of SBOM. He's probably going to be leading a lot of the conversation. I come at it from the industry side, and of course, Alan, being with CISA, comes at it from the agency side. So let me introduce you to Alan Friedman.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I see we're being translated, so I'll try to talk at not quite as fast as I usually do. But the one thing that I will say is I'm sort of known as the guy who doesn't shut up about SBOM. And hopefully today, folks are familiar with the basics. We'll wander through it. And it'll also be a chance for you to ask questions, raise concerns, yell at us, all sorts of things. So briefly, my background, I started off as a computer scientist. I wasn't a very good one. So I got my PhD in applied economics, which means I'm not really an economist. Postdoc in computer science, realized, nope, right the first time, still not a computer scientist. And so by then, I was a mediocre cryptographer, a mediocre economist, and a mediocre computational modeler. And when you're mediocre at that many things, you sort of gravitate to Washington, D.C. And so spent time as an academic and then got invited to join government about 7 years ago. First at the Department of Commerce at NTIA, the National Telecommunication and Information Administration, and then I moved over to CISA. And I've done work on a number of security issues, basically trying to take the exciting and turn it into boring. Because I think that's a lot of how we make progress, is take something that everyone fights over and says, actually, this isn't too hard. Let's just all do it together. So I ran the first US government project on coordinated vulnerability disclosure, because once upon a time, my hair was longer and I was a bit of a hacker. It was the first time we had said, hey, let's put security researchers and product security teams in a room and have them figure out how we can collaborate. And now, coordinated vulnerability disclosure, I would argue, is a pretty boring topic that everyone kind of knows, right? It's now built into policy, and it's no longer sexy. So a few years ago, we moved on to SBOM, software bill of materials, the radical idea that we should actually know what's in our software.
Yeah. And in thinking about this, we should just be clear on what SBOM is. A little bit deeper dive, right? So it's an inventory of the libraries and the dependencies and the code. So you want to have analysis of that. You want to have some idea as to what's in that code, because there's vulnerabilities, there's malicious code. There's a lot of bad actors out there. Obviously, they're trying to hack systems. And there's an awful lot at stake with that. And I'm gonna speak to some of that. And the way I was kind of thinking about it, let's talk about the impact. But before we even get to that, let's talk about why this is an important topic right now and why June 11th was an important date. So 2 weeks ago, there was a deadline for federal agencies and software vendors to be clear on what their role is with self-attestation. And self-attestation is basically saying we're in compliance with EO 14028, Executive Order 14028, which the Biden administration put forth a couple of years ago. And you're basically, as a vendor, as a software maker, saying, you know, we have a clear idea as to what vulnerabilities, what bad elements are in the code. So here's our attestation. But guess what? Nobody really knows about it. It's funny, when I was talking with Alan at the start of this, he said to me, so, you know, what's your approach to this? Like, do you come across a lot of customers that are doing self-attestation? That's a hard no. I come across no customers that are doing any sort of attestation for SBOM. And it's scary. And I'll get to what's at stake shortly. It might help, Alan, if you just kind of fill in a little bit.
Sure. So first, who has heard the term self-attestation, which is sort of a interesting turn of phrase? It's not entirely clear that I can make an attestation other than about something that I have, but we won't quibble about semantics and definitions when the White House is involved. So let's go back in time to 2021, because what we're talking about is actually 3 years old now. And Executive Order 14028 is a nice 40-page honkin' document, created a bunch of things, including the Cyber Review Board, that has done some really great work recently on, you know, hey, what the hell's up with Microsoft these days? All sorts of things. But Section 4 of that executive order basically said, you got to be this high to ride the federal government roller coaster. You know, we're kind of tired of, and I say this with love to people who provide software to the federal government, we in the US government are kind of tired of using terrible software. And there are a whole bunch of rules that already exist to try to correct this. And so this was the National Security Council's attempt to say, let's just create 7 or 8 basic things that everyone has to do. You gotta have MFA, table stakes today. Your development environment, your build environment must be separate from your development environment, and both of those need to have protections. You've gotta have basic vulnerability scanning. Right? 7 or 8 properties. The one that was sort of genuinely new in that is software bill of materials. So we'll spend some time talking about that. So then what happened? Then we sort of took that and handed it over to NIST, and NIST said, of those properties, we're going to build a framework that talks about all of secure software development, the SSDF, Secure Software Development Framework. 800-218 for those of you who like numbers in your life. And then back to the White House, OMB said, all right, we're going to take this framework, which is big picture, and we're going to turn that into a compliance model where we're going to create a form that a company needs to sign that says, I have done these things. And so those things include what we were talking about. You sort of sign a form, your CEO or a designated officer has to sign a legal form. We went from, and we'll talk about going technical artifacts versus legal artifacts in a little bit. But I have done all these things. And again, similar concepts, what we talked about that were in the original executive order, MFA, development environment, using scanning tools. SBOM is not explicitly in the self-attestation form, but it is implicitly in there because you have to attest the fact that you are tracking provenance of third-party code. And I would argue that it is difficult to say that you are doing that without doing that in an organized fashion, and that gets back to SBOM. Regulation, so who does it apply to? It applies to all software that is provided to the government. It does not apply to open source. It does not apply to, and this is one of those things that I always feel a little awkward saying publicly, but I think we missed an opportunity. We gave ourselves in the government an out. We said, this doesn't apply to us. And I'm like, So we're working to make sure that the U.S. government is leading by example, but we didn't lock ourselves into that one. July 11th, as Mark mentioned, is when that applies. Sorry, June 11th, thank you, is when this applies to critical software. And I believe the deadline is, oh gosh, is this in your notes?
Not in my notes.
I was reviewing the dates. It's in September when it applies to all software that we buy. And you may say, well, hey, when is software actually critical? Right? Is my software not critical? And NIST created a good definition inspired by the SolarWinds attack, or the attack against SolarWinds, which says there is some software that sits in our network which, if that is undermined, it undermines the integrity of our entire system. So think security systems that run at privileged perspective. Think identity systems that allow to unlock keys, et cetera. That is the domain of critical software. All right, that was a long version of the story, Mark.
Great stuff. So why is there all this non-compliance? Like, what have we learned about this? Well, it's due to budget and staff limits. There's limited resources that are being dedicated to the issue. And you know, what's the, we can talk about the impetus. Alan mentioned SolarWinds. There's cyber intrusions. There's incidents all the time. And of course, there's vulnerabilities. And the attack surface is large and varied. So you put it all together, and this makes for a serious problem. And there are other issues at play here, right? We mentioned it. There's a lack of awareness. There are personnel within the software vendor industry. They're just completely unaware. They're unaware that there are vulnerabilities in their software. There's a need for education. And let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges around, okay, so you're required to attest to the fact that you're aware of these vulnerabilities, that you're doing some sort of, you're going through processes to address them. But what are, you know, what are the challenges there, right? Well, implementation. You've got complex systems throughout the U.S. government. You've got legacy systems. There's just a lot of like outdated systems out there that, and it's very, very hard to track the vulnerabilities inside of them. You know, I don't have to tell you folks, there's a skilled shortage in our industry of people who know what to do with code and with software, and that's ongoing. There's evolving cyber threats, right? There's a lot of sophisticated bad actors out there. They're constantly looking for new and interesting ways to widen the attack surface and to bore right in. And it's happening as we speak, and it's happening in a lot of, you know, different ways. It's happening in our Space Force. There's a war being fought there, so, you know, there's a lot of bad actors out there trying to infiltrate those systems. There's zero-day vulnerabilities. It's not always clear what the immediate response is to that. It takes time, and it takes skill to figure out, well, okay, we have a problem here. How do we isolate it, and how do we remediate it? I don't have to tell you folks, the U.S. government is a bureaucracy. The decision-making processes are very slow, very slow. It takes a very, very long time to do anything about some of these awful infiltrations that are happening in the systems, or that are being, you know, taken against the systems. All right, so let's talk. I want to talk about what's at stake, because there's an awful lot at stake. I'm reading from my notes, and they go on and on and on. So I'm going to give you the high view. We're talking about delivery of government services. And I'm pausing because let's think about that for a minute. There are members of the VA. There are obviously the military. So much of the U.S. economic system is dependent on the government, and if you can't deliver those services because of attacks and vulnerabilities in the system, then that's an awful lot at stake. let's talk about the integrity of personal information, right? There's a lot of personal data that's being managed by the private sector. If there's no trust in how the information is being managed, again, it's a serious problem. Let's talk about it from the perspective of software vendors, like the one I work for. We can lose contracts if we're not on this, if we're not providing the attestation and doing the vulnerability management that goes into this executive order.
Which, by the way, I should add, is something that we would like to see that stick brandished a little more inside the government, saying, you know, listen, you have to live up to this. So I am glad that that threat is there and hopefully is landing.
Yep. We talk about ineligibility. If you've got a federal contract and you're not in compliance, you're going to lose that eligibility, according to the way the executive order lays this out. Contract termination, which leads to lawsuits. Reputational damage, right? Let's talk about trust and reliability. If all of a sudden it's perceived by the federal government that they can't trust the security of your software, you're not going to win that contract. You're not going to continue to do business with the United States government. Bad publicity. You'll lose future opportunities. If you don't comply with what is required by EO 14028, you open yourself up to increased regulatory scrutiny, enhanced audits, fines. There's financial penalties that go along with that. Operational disruption, right? And that diverts resources from other important projects within your organization. And then you also find yourself at a competitive disadvantage. If the government perceives that there are more secure operators out there, they're going to go with them and they're going to be dismissive of your organization. So I've listed several, and I could list several more elements of what's at stake by not being in compliance with the law here. Turn it over to you again.
Sure. So, again, from zooming out a little bit, will these basic requirements guarantee that there is no breach or no security incident? I do not believe that is the case, and I do not believe that anyone with security experience would say yes. This is about table stakes. I would argue that the intention behind the original executive order in 2021 was to use the lever that the administration had to raise the quality of all software in the United States, not just for the US government, but trying to improve the overall ecosystem. So that was the intention. But where we are today in 2024 is in the domain of compliance, and that's why you're here, is to talk about that. So the basics shouldn't shock anyone. As we mentioned, things like vulnerability scanning, and we can dive back into that in a second. But since we threw SBOM in the title, and since I've been thinking about SBOM for 5 years, we're going to talk a little more about SBOM. Is everyone here familiar with the basic concept of a software bill of materials? So we use the analogy of a list of ingredients, right? I go to the store, I buy a Twinkie, it comes with a list of ingredients. Why do we expect more transparency from a non-biodegradable snack than we do from the software that is running our national security systems, right? This still has been, it seems so obvious to me that it has been shocking that we've been fighting this uphill battle. It's less uphill now than it used to be. But and I think no one needed to be reminded of the list of ingredients metaphor, except it's also useful to remember what a list of ingredients doesn't give us, right? A list of ingredients in a grocery store by itself will not prevent someone in your family from eating something that they are violently allergic to, right? The list of ingredients by itself won't keep me on my summer swimsuit diet. It will not by itself keep me on a religious diet or a plant-based diet or whatever it is that is important to me. But good luck doing any of those things without that list of ingredients. So I think it's important to understand that it is a necessary but not sufficient condition. You know, when the SolarWinds attack happened, we got a lot of questions from press. Hey, would SBOM have stopped this? And there were a lot of very, smug people on Twitter who said, SBOM wouldn't have stopped this. And they're absolutely right. No one said it would. Right? And SBOM also won't pick up your dry cleaning before it closes for the weekend. But of the things that we know we need to pay attention to in our supply chain and in our management of software, things start with transparency. It starts with that level of visibility. And so that's why we've been focusing on this and pushing this concept. Now, we can talk about how this will impact different roles, and then we can talk maybe a little about the implementation. Does that sound good?
Yeah, and you know what? I can probably give you a good segue into that.
Please.
Yeah. So Alan referred to the impact and the implementation, right? And if you kind of think of it, you break it out among the federal agencies and the vendors, right? So what's the impact? What has to be implemented by the federal agencies? Well, they have to update their procurement processes to require SBOMs and self-attestation from the software vendors. They need to do the updates, and it's not clear yet if that's being done.
We do have draft FAR language that was circulated last year, and this is going to be one of those awkward moments where hopefully by the end of the sentence I remember that I think it was 2103. Anyone want to remember which FAR case that is? So there is FAR language that was circulated last year for public comment that mentioned FAR language. Notably, it is in a different FAR case than the other pieces of Executive Order 14028. So most of EO 1428 is in one FAR case. The SBOM language is actually in an earlier FAR case that dealt with incident response.
Sounds pretty fragmented.
It is slightly different. It's one of those things that if we'd planned it more strategically, it could have been a little better. But this is what we have, and as you pointed out, it is not explicitly in contract language today. One of the things we're trying to do at CISA is help come up with some more unified contract language. And we think this is good for agencies, so they have something that is turnkey. Yeah. And it will also, we think, be much better for industry because they won't have to have subtly different industry requirements. So first, if I can ask a show of hands for feds, govies, mills, .ics, a few of you. CISA, we are hosting our second government SBOM forum in July. That is open only to government folks, so it's a safe space. We can bitch about our contractors. No, we can talk about things in a secure way. And one of the goals of that meeting is to have agencies that have written language to share them so we can find common points and bring things together. And this is where I'm going to start saying CISA.gov/SBOM to find out how you can get involved in those efforts. And I'll say that like 12 more times before this panel is over.
Wait, I get a shameless plug too. At
Oh,
point.
good.
So let me just go on to the vendor impact of SBOM and its implementation. So what do vendors need to do? They need to produce the SBOMs themselves, and they have to submit the self-attestations to demonstrate compliance with the executive order. And there's one more element to it. There's these compliance agencies. They have to require the updates. They have to do the auditing. And again, it's not clear, are they doing this? Are they doing it well? Are they securing the system in the way it needs to be?
So, and Mark, you know, the joy of looking at anything in detail is you realize that everything is a fractal, right? As you zoom in, you sort of see it. So, you know, what are the agencies going to do with the damn SBOMs once they all get them delivered as part of their contracts? So one way that I find it helpful is to break things out into three broad buckets of roles. For software, there are people who make software. There are people who buy software, and we use the term choose software because we want to be inclusive of our open source friends. And then there are people who operate software. And of course, many of us do all three of those things, right? We're all in the supply chain, but most of us are in the middle, right? Aqua uses software that you get from other people, and you turn around and deliver that to your customers. So let's walk through these three roles. If you make software, you need to know what you have, right? You need to know what you have from a vulnerability perspective, and maybe you can talk about how you guys sort of help that in more general buckets in a moment. And by the way, not just from a security perspective, it's not just making sure that the things that you're building aren't automatically vulnerable or aren't automatically linked to the entities list. There's a cost issue, there's a quality issue. Are you using software that is licensed with an open source license that means that you could get sued if you don't open source your software? So for those of you who play in software, especially in open source, you may know about a license called the GPL license, which basically says if you use any software under the GPL license as an ingredient in your software, guess what? Your software is now licensed under the GPL. I don't know if you all remember back in the late 90s when Steve Ballmer was going around saying open source is a cancer that will destroy software. This was when like long-haired Alan used to write Microsoft with a little dollar sign in it. He was saying open source will destroy software. And guess what? He was right. Open source has eaten almost all of software. One company produced an estimate that said 96% of software that they scanned, it was a scanning vendor that did this study, had at least some open source in it. So you need to know the license, you need to know the security features, and it's a quality issue, right? Are you using software that is end-of-lifed? Are you using 8 versions of the same library? Someone has done some teardowns, fortunately, of a switch manufacturer that we're not very fond of here in the United States, and found out not only is it wildly insecure, it's ridiculously bloated, right? They're using a whole bunch of different versions of software, much of which they stole from American companies, but that's not what this panel's about. So producers, you need to know about what you have, not just from a security perspective, but it's a cost and quality issue. Then we have the idea of choosing software. Are you making the right decision for time of procurement? And again, why would you buy from someone who couldn't tell you what they have in it? We can go all the way back about 10 years ago. A guy named Sunil Yu, who was the research CISO for Bank of America at the time. And he was already asking for SBOMs 10 years ago. Now, you could fax it over to him because he knew that the data wasn't usable at the time. But he also knew that if you didn't know what was in your software, his total cost of ownership was going to be a lot higher. So it's a matter of judging the quality of the developing agency or the developing organization to say, if you can't produce an SBOM, what else is wrong with how you make your software? And of course, we need to do all of our supply chain risk management. Vulnerabilities, yes, but is this linked to organizations I don't trust? Where is it developed? This stuff may not be in the SBOM, but you can use that data and map it to other things you care about.
I mean, there's tools, processes, and infrastructure that have to be secure as well. I think that's what you're referring to.
Exactly. And then the last role is operating software. And in many organizations, right, you buy the software, you operate it, that's the same role. In the US government, sadly, that is not the same role, right? And that causes all kinds of problems, but people who operate software, need to be prepared for new risks, right? When Log4j came about, right, you may remember this, it wasn't that long ago. It was over Christmas, so everyone was sort of hunched over their travel laptops in family guest rooms trying to figure out, for God's sakes, where is this vulnerability, which is being actively exploited? Where is it on my networks? If you had an SBOM, this was an easy thing to do. You could easily triage into, I need to worry about this, but everything else, I don't need to worry about. So this is this idea, and you talked about 0 days. We're not going to be able to prevent that. An SBOM isn't about discovering 0 days. It's about saying, once we have known badness, however you want to define known badness, right? Is it on the, is it in the National Vulnerability Database? Is it on the CISA known exploited vulnerability, the KEV list? Is it on your secret squirrels? Psst, don't tell anyone, but you really shouldn't have this, right? Depending on what you have. The goal is to be able to say, I can deal with it quickly. That's the magical property of resilience. And one more story on that, which is, since Kaspersky is back in the news, by public reporting, it took the secret squirrels about 6 months from start to finish to determine that Kaspersky Lab software shouldn't be on the US government networks. Right? Wasn't that hard a decision in retrospect. It's a highly privileged piece of software that runs at an elevated privilege, that sends data outside the country. Took us close to 5 years to be able to definitively say, yes, we have gotten this off US government networks. Why? Because everything didn't say Kaspersky on the side of it. You needed to look inside a lot of systems to figure out where it was. Mm-hmm. So SBOM is really useful for the operators of software. It's useful for the choosers or buyers of software, and going all the way back, it's helpful for the people who make software as well.
I think you're sensing I'm deferring a lot of this talk to Alan.
I do a lot of ranting.
And he's got some key expertise for this issue. I can talk about my organization a little bit, just in terms of how do we approach vulnerabilities and bad actors and SBOM. So without going too deep into the history of Aqua, where we are now is we take a unified approach to cybersecurity. Right? So we secure the build, we secure the infrastructure, we secure your runtime. And within the product, there's a lot of different controls for malware, for you name it, all sorts of bad actors out there doing all sorts of things. You name it, we have a control for it. It's in our settings. But again, it's important that you're aware that it's a unified approach. A lot of software vendors come at this, they focus on just the infrastructure, or just the build, or just the runtime. We do all three. We think we do it extremely well. What we offer in terms of SBOM is we can give you an automated way to generate a software bill of materials so that you're able to do a self-attestation, so that you're able to contend with what it is you're required of from the government. So it aligns with the requirements, it enables transparency, and it proves compliance, it proves security. Go ahead.
And Mark, I just want to say, that automation is key.
Yeah.
Where, just one, in general, anything we're doing in security in 2024, if we're not doing it explicitly built for automation, we're doing it wrong. Right? We really need to focus on that. And the challenge of SBOM generation is not, I would say, completely solved, but we've made a lot of progress on it. There are a lot of great tools. Obviously, CISA can't endorse Aqua's tools, but if you have a modern software development environment, if the words CI/CD are a key part of your project, if you are using a cloud native set of tools and projects, if you're using modern language, SBOM should be easy for you. And if your team can't do it, you should find out why. There's a command in Docker called SBOM. You know what it does? It gives you an SBOM. It's very nice of it. There are automated tools built into GitHub and GitLab that can support this. Now, are they perfect? They are not. Great paper just came out by some southern Italian universities, of all places, that sort of said, here's where we can show what some of these automated tools miss. So that may be an example to say, start with the free automated tools and then graduate to some of our better services out there that sort of specialize in saying we can get you that quality. But you can do that. Now, when I use that Docker example on stage, I love keeping an eye on my friends who work in, embedded systems or weapons systems software, because it drives them a little crazy, because they're like, that doesn't work. I cannot containerize my F-16. I'd love to, but a lot of our systems don't have those very modern environments. They're either legacy or they're built in such a specialized way that we can't do that. And there are more and more tools out there for that. And especially as you look up the supply chain, you can start to say, well, let's figure out where we can insert that automation. And then as a last piece, there are tools in the market today that can look at a compiled piece of software and still create an SBOM using binary analysis tools. It's important to acknowledge that these are still heuristics based. They're not 100% active. They're not deterministic. But they're a lot better today than they were a few years ago. And so you're seeing more and more folks in, say, critical infrastructure starting to rely on these scanning tools to say, hey, this has been sitting on my network for a few years. I'm not going to be able to unplug it anytime soon, but I need to know what's inside it. And so we can use that kind of scanning tool for that. So I interrupted you, Mark, to talk about the generation side of things.
I want to speak to supply chain security, and as mentioned, we're taking that unified approach, but it starts with this whole shift left movement. So we're focused on the code, we're focused on the build. That's part of the component analysis that we do. What's being scanned, right? It's the images. People talk about containers, and I can talk your ear off about containerized protection in runtime. I won't do that. What I will say is that we have a containerized solution where we're scanning the code, we're scanning the image-based code that goes into the containers. This is shift left security, and we count ourselves as excellent, an excellent vendor in the component analysis space. And this is to do the analysis for the open source and the third-party components, looking for the vulnerabilities, looking for any licensing issues. It all has to be addressed as part of the executive order, and this is where our focus is as far as shift left security.
And when we think about sort of using this data, what do we scan for? There's some straightforward ones Mark talked about, hey, are there vulnerabilities? Are there license concerns? But as organizations begin to mature, they're thinking about risk. There's a lot more stuff we can look for. So who is familiar with a library called XZ, or XZ as our Brits friends call it? So this was probably the scariest vulnerability I've seen in the last 10 years. Far worse than Log4j. Because it was a planted back door from a campaign that had gone on for 3 or 4 years. It was an open source component that was used in a lot of software, buried deep in the supply chain. And there was a very subtle backdoor. This was not obfuscated code. This was not obvious code. This was one of those super clever, we're going to put in 3 or 4 characters that allows, in this case, it would have permitted a directory traversal that would not have been detected by automated scanning tools. We found out about it pure luck. There was someone who was committed to performance testing and said, that's funny, this particular build is taking a few hundred milliseconds more than it should have. What's going on here? And he dug and he dug and he dug and he found it wasn't even in all versions of it. It was just in one particular repo that then fed into the Debian project. SBOM, again, would not have detected this, but it allows us to understand where do we need to focus on. So how many components that are in your supply chain have a single maintainer? And again, where there's one person, which could be compromised, right? Their signing key could be stolen. Happens a lot more than we know about. Or there's a terrible thing in the open source world that they call it the bus problem. I hate that term. It just, what depends on one human being not getting hit by the bus? I prefer the lottery problem, right? I have won the lottery, and so I'm just going to piece out from maintaining this piece of open source software that your product depends on. You need visibility into that risk, even if you can't do anything specific about it. You can set up automated tools to monitor for it. So trying to track this stuff is useful and, again, requires that visibility, which then you can feed into tools that can do your vigilance for you. But it starts with visibility.
Yeah, that's a big word in our organization, and sales folks are out there all the time. Do you have visibility into your vulnerabilities? I just want to reference something Alan had just mentioned around if we look at how security needs to be done, an important element is assumed breach, right? So everybody, big movement in the government is zero trust, right? Assumed breach. And what is assumed breach? Well, from my understanding, it's the fact that you have these inside actors, and they're just as likely to be causing a breach or an issue or malfeasance as anyone from the outside. And that's important to know, because you have to train zero trust on the insiders. So I think it's important to bring that up in this discussion. It's something we as a software vendor, as a container protection software vendor, think about all the time. How do we address assumed breach? Someone from the inside doing bad things.
So we should probably leave a little bit of time for questions in case there are some, but I want to sort of give a little update. First, on the question of zero trust, I often get asked, okay, what is the relationship between zero trust and SBOM? And that's a great question. They're both buzzwords for the last 3 or 4 years. In this case, I think they are related in terms of security posture, of what are we preparing for. And both of them start with the idea that we cannot anticipate all risks. And so for SBOM, we need visibility to anticipate risks. And for a zero trust architecture, it's assume that not everything is going to work as expected and have a posture that you can respond. So both of them enable this global property that we always talk about, which is resilience. Resilience is one of these things that, at the risk of working slightly blue, it's like the famous definition of pornography, which is Mark's now cringing. God damn it, I'm on a panel with someone from the government, and they've already brought up pornography, and it's not 9 a.m.
No,
yet.
that's just-
But it's the idea that we can't
Right up my
necessarily
alley,
define
sir.
it.
Right up my alley.
But
No
we'll
problem.
know it when we see it. And resilience is the model of saying, how do we adapt? And we may not be able to always say, I need these 7 things for resilience, but it is, how do I move to a posture where I can respond? And that really is the core philosophy behind Zero Trust, making sure that a single breach doesn't upset my entire security environment. And similarly for SBOM, it's saying, once we have known badness is someone else's department, but once we have that, we know what to do, and we're equipped, and we can have the data in our tools to respond. So where are we in making good on this idea of visibility? One of the other cliches in cybersecurity is we're always building the plane while flying it, right? If we waited until it was perfect, we will be really good at fighting the last war. So we pushed for SBOM while it is a maturing technology. I won't say that everything works perfectly. One of our challenges now is interoperability. You know, we have an SBOM creation model here, we have an SBOM creation model here. Sometimes they will produce very similar SBOMs, but not always. So one of the things we're going to be doing at CISA, as soon as my money comes through in September, is doing an interoperability exercise. We're going to be working with Aqua and some of the other large vendors and small vendors out there to say, how do we not choose the best one? We don't want to bake off, but we want to make sure that similar tools, because many organizations use different tools and different vendors inside the same organization, but we're producing similar SBOMs. And where in the specifications are we underspecified? Where is there ambiguity? So I'll give you an example for those of you who are on the technical side. We did this once back in 2021. And one of the things we looked at is taking the hash. And it turns out that 4 different open source tools produced 4 different hashes of the sample components. Now, the only purpose of a hash is it's a mathematical certainty. And so, right, if we're producing different hashes, we're being useless. So we need to figure out, how do we make sure that we're all aligned for interoperability? We need to do a better job in the government of working with industry to make sure that our specifications are universal. And one of my priorities is also making sure that we're harmonizing with other governments around the world. SBOM isn't just an American idea. The Japanese government has produced SBOM guidance. The German government has an SBOM requirement that is candidly very strong, but also unrealistically strict. And the 800-pound gorilla on the other side of the Atlantic is something called the Cyber Resilience Act, which just passed in the EU, which will require that every piece of software sold inside the European Union has to have an SBOM available to their national regulator. And so that's going to be something that is going to come down at us awful fast and may involve bringing in European standards organizations. So we're working on harmonizing on that front.
Well, we definitely want to give time for questions. Let me just make a quick concluding statement here. I'm assuming we have some software vendors in the audience here. I think it's crucial at this point, based on what we're discussing around SBOMs, prioritize compliance, right? You want to maintain your federal contracts. You want to maintain your eligibility. You want to protect your reputation. You want to stay competitive. Demonstrate a commitment to robust security measures and practices, and that you're securing your software development lifecycle. continuous improvement should be a big part of what the software vendor community is doing. They should be increasing their investment in these types of activities. And be responsive to the emerging threats that are out there so that when you are called upon by a compliance agency or a procurement department to prove that you're dealing with what's before us, right? These vulnerabilities, these bad actors, these threats, that you're meeting the ask. So I'll stop there because again, I definitely want to give time for questions.
We may or may not have a mic in the center if anyone has questions.
We definitely have a mic in the center.
Wonderful. Oh, there you go. Sorry, it was hidden by the...
Maybe it'd be good just to ask, show of hands, are there a lot of software vendors in the audience or a few? Yeah.
All right. Do you guys make SBOMs? Yeah? Is it easy? No. What's the pain point? Quality of the data. Yeah, you're not wrong, especially when you're dependent on upstream sources for that data. So one of the places to get involved, if you're not familiar with it, is something called the Open Source Security Foundation. It's under the auspices of the Linux Foundation. We work closely with them because open source is like pushing on a string, right? Your software is provided as is. There's a French developer who wrote a blog post over Christmas last year, and he said, "I am not your supply chain." And it really, if you read the tone of the blog post, it should be, "I am not your expletive supply chain." After Log4j, an open source developer posted a very kindly anonymized letter. He's the lead maintainer for a project, and he got a letter from a bank that basically said, "We need you to give us all this information." And I sort of wish he had actually told everyone what the bank was, because you can't do that to an open source project. If you're using open source, it is your responsibility to use it responsibly. It's not the maintainer's job to do anything that you ask for it. If it doesn't give you what you want, you've got a couple of options. Get involved, roll up your sleeves, and help, or pick something else. One of the things we're doing at CISA is working with our partners across the US government and DoD to create some principles and practices for responsible use of open source, and that involves things like helping to come up with scores about particular projects and packages so that you can easily determine, is this responsible? But also get a pattern of enabling government agencies and contractors to be able to work directly with the open source community to meet the needs that we have. Because right now it's not even clear if you're a US government employee, are you even allowed to officially contribute to say, "Oh, I found a security bug, let me go and fix it myself." So we're working on the policy side as well as the technical side. Sure. Mm-hmm. Right. So the question was, hey, what about this idea of an SBOM, which I believe it really originates from our friends in DoD OCIO. And their model is saying, well, we need to track things other than just the software. And so they talk about a hardware bill of materials, a data bill of materials. There's a term now of an AI bill of materials, cryptographic bill of materials, right? As we pivot towards cryptographic agility for a post-quantum world, the first step, again, always is visibility. But it's important to understand what the gaps are and what the differences are in different types of transparency. There are some projects out there that say we can do hardware bill of materials today. I don't believe them, right? I can take a hash of a piece of software and feel confident that I know what that piece of software is. You can't take a hash of a DIM. Right now, everyone who builds something, right, if you're a manufacturer of stuff, you need a manufacturing bill of materials, right? You can't build something without knowing what the pieces are. But right now, almost all of that is based on SKUs, stock keeping units. So you can say, hey, listen, I am using an LTE modem chip, or I am using, a DIM of this size. But we don't have the provenance data that we need to say, okay, was this made in Taiwan or China? Or heck, since we know how long it's going to take to wean ourselves off Chinese semiconductors, was this made at the official factory in Shenzhen, or was it made at the identical factory that they built down the road off the books to create counterfeit products of American companies' goods? We don't have that visibility today. That is going to be a longer-term project. CISA published a framework for thinking about a hardware bill of materials. We're going to all have to work together on that. If you're interested in AI bombs, we have a working group now that is spinning up to look at how do we track what goes into a generative AI system. AI is software, and the vulnerabilities today, so some of you may have read about a vulnerability in Llama, a very prominent AI platform that had a really bad and really obvious vulnerability in it. But we need to start thinking about risks to data and all the fun new vulnerabilities that we have in AI. Are you guys thinking about AI risk?
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're on it. We have teams, projects dedicated to looking at AI and looking at the vulnerabilities. What are the risks? How do we quantify them? How do we remediate them? So yes, it's ongoing.
So my recommendation as we think about transparency data is to maintain a principle of modularity, of rather than putting everything into giant data structures. And I understand the temptation to do that, and I understand why DoD sort of gravitates in that direction. But in the short run, the focus should be on linkability, right? I have a blinking box that's keeping grandma alive in a hospital. I have a complex communication system sitting in a tower inside a forward operating base. It's going to have hardware, it's going to have software, it's going to have data. Let's make sure, and inside that, it's going to have a lot of different subcomponents. Let's talk about how do we link all that data together so that I can feed that into my vulnerability management system. I can feed it into my supply chain risk monitoring. I can feed it into my auditing system, and make sure that we can assemble that data as we need to.
Other questions, please.
CISA works with our friends at NIST and all of our partners in the federal government and in the broader vulnerability community to make sure that we can safeguard software systems. One thing that recently was introduced from CISA is the idea of vulnenrichment, where we're going to look at the future of CVEs themselves rather than a single database to say, how do we make sure that the quality of vulnerabilities themselves is supported, and we can move forward and make progress on that. So someone inside CISA coined the term vulnenrichment, because why not? And so that's something, if you're interested, I encourage you to think about. I'll also add that one key challenge that we keep bumping into in the SBOM world is software identity is a really hard problem. There's a famous quote by Phil Carlton. It says, there are only two hard things in all of computer science: cache and validation, and naming things. And off by one errors. No, wait, it is really hard in a system to tell the difference between Windows _10 and Windows -10. Right now, our software identifier models, CPE, Common Platform Enumeration, was built in a world where we assumed there would be about 100 suppliers of software. It's outdated. The open source world has sort of moved on to something called package URLs or PURLs, which isn't an identifier per se, but it takes advantage of the local identity features in software packages, right? So most package managers, you can't have two things that have the same name. So I just say, we point you to NPM, and then NPM is responsible. So it's like DNS. But there are other ways of thinking about identifiers as well. If you're using devices, there are product identifiers and so on. We need to understand for the future of vulnerabilities, how do we handle multiple different identification schema? I think that's one of the hardest problems we have today. And we're working on it at CISA. We issued a white paper saying here's some paths forward, and we're going to be proposing something pretty soon.
One thing I just want to address in terms of vulnerability management, something I've seen from a customer that I thought was important and resonates was he comes at it from governance. He's thinking constantly about, well, we're going to get fined if we don't do proper risk management. Great, we can find all these vulnerabilities. We can do all the reporting. We can filter them down. But that's just a list. How do we do risk scoring? So he's looking at not in terms of like, criticals and highs and lows. He's looking at it in terms of, subsets or supersets, and these are the, this is how you score that. So I don't know if this directly addresses your question, but it seems to me that's a really intelligent approach to how we go about risk management in our world.
One thing that we've pushed for at CISA is an alternative to CVSS called SSVC, which is stakeholder-specific vulnerability calculation. It's also CVSS backwards. And the vision there is rather than coming up with a single number, it's a decision tree. I don't know if anyone's looked at the CVSS equation before. It contains a sixth order function. Nowhere in all of physics will you ever be asked to take anything to the sixth power. That's not how the world works. But they needed it to make the math work out, right? It's very much smart people work to build that. I don't want to degrade it, but it's very much like consultant driven. SSVC is built on the idea that you have decision trees that allow you to think about not just the software itself, but how you're using it. So for example, is the software currently internet facing? That is a huge distinction for risk, right? If your Avanti box is just sitting in the middle of your network and it's not talking to anything except a couple of other trusted boxes, yeah, you should put it on your priority list, but it's not, holy crap, kill it with fire now. If your Avanti box is currently connected to the internet, you need to yank that, like you need to dive across the room because that is unpatchable and has 20-year-old cryptographic software inside it. So that SSVC gives you that idea. If you're curious about that, Google SSVC and CISA, and we are very happy to talk to your organization about that model. Mark, do you know when we're supposed to get kicked off the stage?
It probably happened already.
Okay.
But that's not
I don't
gonna
want to
stop
keep
us,
everyone
folks.
from their thing. I can keep talking about this all day and probably will for the rest of the day, but want to make sure that we're not keeping anyone from their thing if you have further questions.
If there are no further questions, yeah, let me give one more shameless plug to my organization, aquasec.com. Again, it's a real privilege to be able to speak to you all today. I really do appreciate your attention, and we hope to talk to you afterwards.
And for those of you who want to learn more about SBOM, CISA.gov/SBOM, we have a weekly public meeting. We have people from the Japanese government participate. We have people from companies around the world participate. If you want to know more about SBOM and what it means for a broader community, this is where we try to one global hub where we can touch base on it. CISA.gov/SBOM. We have a weekly meeting, and if you're really interested in it, we are doing an SBOM-orama in September in Denver, where we're going to try to bring together the entire SBOM community, including an SBOM vendor showcase, or an SBOM solution showcase, where we have 24 solution providers and a long wait list of other great organizations. So if anyone says that there aren't SBOM solutions out there, they're simply not telling you the truth. I'll be around for a little bit if you want to talk more. Thank you so much. And Mark, thank you for giving me an excuse to come over to Baltimore and chat about SBOM.
Yeah, real privilege. Thank you. Thank you all.